Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of the Classics Show. I'm your host Umar Khalid. But today we're in the outdoors, as you can see, a little bit of change from the usual indoor that we were having with all the previous programs. But today is a special program, if I can say that, because we're going to talk about a topic that many of you might not know about. It's postmodernism. Now, what is postmodernism and what are the implications in our society, and is it relevant to our society or others? We'll be in conversation with two very eminent personalities on that in this very special episode of the Classics Show. Let me introduce the guests to you. My first one on my right is Dr. Masood Raja. He's an assistant professor of English at the University of North Texas. Thank you very much, sir, to have joined us.
Thank you.
Next to him is a guest to our country for a very short amount of time. He's been giving a lot of lectures and symposiums in different universities in Pakistan since his arrival. Dr. Haj Ross, he's professor of linguistics at the University of North Texas. Thank you very much, Dr. Haj, to have joined us.
My pleasure.
Now, I'll ask my first question to you directly, Dr. Haj. What is postmodernism?
Wow. That question should have stopped with my friend here. I don't worry very much about literary categories like that. I am more humble. I stick to the words in front of me, which apparently is not a very postmodernist thing to do. This man here knows everything about postmodernism, though.
So let's ask you then, Dr. Masood.
Well, thank you, Haj. But yeah, I mean, Haj is being very humble because, I mean, when it comes down to it, he can do things with language which people like me can never imagine. But to answer your question, it's a very hard question to answer because no one has a consensus
to all
on
of
it.
those, for
But
example, of our viewers who do not understand what the
Okay.
concept is all about.
Yeah, so I mean, loosely speaking, postmodernism is when any writer or artist looks at the traditional modernist forms of art and plays with it and inserts something that you would otherwise not think of. Like as we were walking here in the art gallery, we saw a wheelbarrow. It's a wooden wheelbarrow and it's being presented as a work of art. Now that's postmodernism because we excised the utility from it, which is to carry loads,
All
and
right.
made it into. So that's, roughly speaking, is whenever you play with the form or you insert something counter to what you expect in a modernist work, you're slightly being postmodernist.
So what is the basic difference then between postmodernism and modernism?
Okay, and I will appreciate whenever Haj can jump into my defense. So, okay, modernist art, or let's say literature, when you read a postmodernist novel, it offers itself as a work of art, like Joyce's Ulysses, Qurratul Ain Haidar's River of Fire, Aag Ka Darya. So the novel says, I am a work of art. Every sentence in me has been deeply crafted, revised, and you can't just sit at an airport and read it. You have to have certain education, certain background knowledge to really access the novel. So that's one major trope of the modernist novel. What the postmodernist novel would do is it would play with that thing. There are novels when you read, the author points to the artificiality of the novel itself, which we call self-reflexivity.
All right.
So that's one aspect of postmodernism.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. Haj, do you have anything to add to it about the difference between modernism and postmodernism in different fields? I mean, not only relegating ourselves to literature, but in general life.
I am really überfragt, as they say in German. I'm asked too much there. It's about, I come to literature from having done sort of humble things like taking words apart and paying attention to phonetics and looking at clauses and very mechanical things. I come to do something which is very rare in America and Canada, which is paying attention to verbal art. Mostly linguists do things, they tear words apart in very interesting ways and things that I love to do. However, my teacher, a gigantic influence on both literature and linguistics, a Russian named Roman Jakobson, he infected me with the desire to understand how it is that words in the hands of a great poet or writer can shine. So we were talking about the most famous line of poetry in the world, to be or not to be, that is the question. And when you look at that very closely, there are things which Shakespeare could have said in the middle of the speech. The speech is Hamlet, who has discovered that his uncle has killed his father, and that he has to either commit a murder to avenge his uncle or live in shame. And so he could have said, whether I should live or not, that is the question. But that doesn't sing. So what I'm interested in is, what is it that poets do to make their words sing and
So
last?
when you say, what is it that makes the words of the poet sing, is that postmodernism
No.
or is that modernism?
I would say it's sort of orthogonal too. I don't think it's either one. People
right.
have been doing this for a long time, but linguists in America have been avoiding this fundamental question. They say they're sort of interested in the fact you run into a store, you want to find the eggs because you have to make an omelet for your cousin who's hungry. So you say things like, where's the eggs, or do you have any eggs, or can you direct me to the eggs? Right, that's sort of a utilitarian concern, and that's what has dominated linguistic thinking in the 20th century. And
Linguistic thinking, in your words, has also become postmodernist in its approach with time. Would you agree?
Maybe so. I don't know. Do you think?
I mean, to add to what Haj just said, for example, he started with to be and not to be.
Or not to be,
So
yes.
as a linguist, he's probably studying the structure of the sentence and why is it unique? Why does it last for 500 years? Why do we quote it? The postmodern twist on it would be if someone put that in an ad.
All right.
So
that would be
that's
interesting.
picking up something classic and then mobilizing it for popular use.
All right.
What he mentioned about words, like how do we use them, what do they do? For example, there is a wonderful novel by J.M. Coetzee called Foe. So that's a play on Daniel Defoe,
All right.
and his novel. But the novel is named Foe, and then the story in it is of Friday, the slave.
okay.
So that's a postmodern twist on the nomenclature, or a character's name in the novel, the author's name, and the story becomes postmodern because it retells the same story of Robinson Crusoe from the point of view of Friday.
Well, that's very interesting. And time to kind of start with our first segment, that is Letter in Spirit. Welcome back. You're watching the Classics Show. I'm your host, Umar Khalid Butt. We're starting with our first segment of the show, that is Letter in Spirit. And my first question, Dr. Masood, would be to you. What are the major trips or the major highlights of postmodernist literature?
Okay, so as I understand it, it's like when you read a postmodern novel or a poet, there are a few things that would stand out to you. One is most of them tend to be parodic. So they will pick up something classic and parodize it or make a parody out of it. Two is a thing called self-reflexivity, which means that the novel or the poem point to you while you're reading it and say, I'm a poem, someone made it, don't trust me that much. And the third aspect of it would be sort of what we call, Linda Hutcheon, the scholar of postmodernism, calls historiographic meta-narrative. So you'll be reading a novel, but there would be a critique of the history incorporated in the novel as well.
All right.
And a great example of it is a novel by Italo Calvino, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. So the first page is, you have just bought Italo Calvino's new novel, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler.
All right.
So the author is pointing to that this is the novel, but it's not an introduction, it's part of the first chapter.
It's interesting because you involve yourself and you kind of twist the words and kind of relate them in a postmodernistic manner, if this is what you're trying
and that postmodernistic manner is that kind of playfulness, you know, where you're not very, you can be very serious. Sometimes you'll pick up live historical characters and make them a character in your novel.
All right.
and then tell the story from
Dr. Haj,
Let me jump in
yes.
because Masood has just suggested something about self-reflexive language. I'm going to give you one of the shortest poems I've ever looked at. It has 7 words. It's a great poem by perhaps the greatest American poet. His name is W.S. Merwin. He's still alive and he's in his 80s. It's called Elegy. This is a word your listeners may not know. It is the kind of thing you read or say when someone has died. So the whole poem is this: who would I show it to? And what's the clue in this is the word would. This word says, I cannot, there's no one who I could show it to. Well, why is that? And that leads us immediately to the fact that we know poets have a special friend who, before they publish their poem, they show it to the friend. And what this poem suggests is that the person who's died is that special friend. So he says, even the title says elegy, this is something about about someone who has died, but he says would. Who would I show it to? Which says I can't show it to anyone. So he is in a postmodern frame of mind. He is saying that he is writing an elegy, even as he is, in the same words, saying he cannot.
All right. Dr. Haj, you've been working a lot with syntax. Now, syntax is also playing with words and kind of putting them to and fro, in front, behind. Postmodernism, as Dr. Masood Raja said, is also kind of in the same vein. I mean, you kind of play with words, you kind of play with the modernistic attitudes, and then you put in the new twist to it and make it postmodern. Now, how would you apply it in literature, in your point of view?
Well, there's a wonderful, I guess you would call it a short story. I believe it's by Barth. It's called Sentence. And it's a sentence which is about 3 pages long. And as it goes along, it comments on itself. It says, now we're entering a new clause. Maybe this is the 40th in this sentence. I hope there's not too many more before it ends, and so on. So, right, you can play with language. You can play with the sounds of language. You can play with meanings. And you can play with the phrases and clauses of it, too.
Yeah, I mean, that, just to add, the sentence is a great, it's by Donald
Barthelme, right.
Yeah, and it's a great example people give you of what is postmodernism, because it's a story, but it's a story of the sentence, but within that there are things that he adds and makes it more complex. So that's really, I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
We use it as a great example of postmodernism.
But Dr. Masood, when a person goes through a piece of postmodernist literature, how would he or she realize that this is in fact postmodernist in nature and not modern?
That's a very good question, because, I mean, most of our students who approach it, there is an announcement in the beginning, this is a course on postmodernism. But I think for a reader,
a layman,
I mean, anytime you pick up a novel and it has a historical event that's either parodized, there is no nostalgic return to history. So it's not valorized, but made fun of. And you see historical characters running around as comical characters, or serious characters being really funny characters. That's a certain kind of postmodernism.
all right.
Because it's rendering the history in a playful, parodic way. I don't have many examples from Urdu, but I mean, there are a lot of instances in English novels.
Please, if you could give one or two.
Like, for example, not funny, but there is a novel by Don DeLillo called Libra.
Okay.
So the novel opens on the first page with a young kid standing at the front of a railway car in the engine and experiencing riding the train. And so we are right there in the mind of Lee Harvey Oswald.
Oh.
So the entire novel, in which there are real characters who were mentioned in the trial, or in all the characters are alive in the novel, but we experience the assassination of JFK from the mind of Lee Harvey Oswald. And so that's a postmodernist novel, because it's telling a history, but not through traditional sources. It's introducing Oswald as a character in his own story.
All right.
So-
That's interesting to show a story from different perspectives to make it change. Now, is that change the postmodernism, or is that a certain concept that you apply to writing, Dr. Hajj? What do you feel?
Ooh, again, a hard question. This idea of play being important in postmodernism, it's very important. It's important to one topic that linguists study is humor. What's funny? And very often, I don't know if I'm going to find a good example for you now of a joke. Yes, here's one. A man comes into a dentist's office and says, to the dentist, I hope you can help me. I think I'm a moth. And the dentist says, sir, this is not a dental problem. You should see a therapist. And the man says, yes, I know. And he says, well, why did you come in my office? And he says, the light was on. Okay. So,
So that he's referring to his being a moth as well.
yes.
That could be a kind of a postmodernistic approach in his way of thinking, the reason why he came to the dentist's office.
Yes, and it has the crucial element of play, of pretending too. So, for instance, tickling. If you don't know a baby and you go and immediately start tickling them, the baby is probably going to scream, and his mother will drive you away. Because in order to be tickled, you have to realize that it's not an attack. It may look like an attack, but it isn't an attack. This is a crucial ability in understanding art, to be able to step back.
Well, that's a really good point, because I've noticed with some of my students too, when sometimes they read a parodic or ironic work, and then they don't
get
realize
it.
that there is irony or parody there, so they read it as a serious work and then totally miss the point.
Yes. Dr. Hajj, another question. What do you feel is the similarity between literature and linguistics?
I think that doing either of them without the other, as my great teacher Roman Jakobson said, if you do either of them without the other, you are a flagrant anachronism. Unfortunately, in America, there are probably less than 20, maybe certainly less than 50 people who study poetry or literature linguistically. In Europe, there are many more, especially in the United Kingdom. You want to do both. You want to have the more viewpoints you can have for looking at something that you're trying to explain, the less you will have blind spots. The word theory is a Greek word which I used to think has theo in it, the Greek word for God, but it's not. It has in it thea instead, which is in theater. And thea, T-H-E-A, in Greek means a point from which to look at something. So really, to have as many theories as you possibly can to look at the same thing, that will give you the smallest number of blind spots. So yes, you should, language is a huge mystery, vast, it will never be understood entirely. If you can look at it both from the point of view of beauty and the point of view of structure and use and origin, you're not so anachronistic as going at it from one direction only.
I think being multidirectional is very important, especially in postmodernistic literature or poetry or any other form of art. I think that is very important because you kind of hold it from another angle that people might not even have thought, that you can approach the story, or you can approach the poem, or you can approach that art from that angle. I mean, you also described the Lee Harvey Oswald's piece of literature on which we see everything through his eyes. That's very important. I think literature needs to evolve, and postmodernist, this concept of postmodernism is very important in kind of evolving literature and the concepts of literature. Theory, of course, I think remains the same, if I'm not wrong, Dr. Hajj, but the thing is that in the long run you need to evolve. You need to evolve new concepts, and concepts are very important to kind of revive literature, to kind of revive poetry, because then everything gets stale, doesn't it?
I just thought of something you will probably like. These are sentences which sort of immolate themselves. They destroy themselves. Linguists love to do this. So for instance, a sentence like, "Don't obey this request." Well, what can you do with that? It's a request that asks you not to comply with it.
That's true.
Or, "This sentence is false."
Yeah,
So-
and to like add a little more to that, I mean, in literature departments, by and large, most of the younger scholars do have to know partially some linguistics, because you already know you're working in post-linguistic terms. You have read your Foucault, you have read your Hayden White, your Derrida, and if you've read your Derrida, you know that you can't really understand Jacques Derrida without knowing language, because that's what he does to language. And so I agree with Haj absolutely that we literary scholars also need to focus on the text itself and the crafted text.
All right. Well, we need to concentrate on the text, the crafted text. This is what literature is all about. This is what the postmodernistic take on literature kind of changes or evolves as far as the writing or the literature is concerned. Time now for our second segment, that is Sound in Silence. Welcome back. You're watching the Classics Show. It's our second segment, that is Sound in Silence, in which we're kind of trying to explore what poetry does to postmodernism. Well, what does poetry do to postmodernism, Dr. Masood?
Or like what postmodernism does to
or
poetry.
the other way
I mean,
around,
like,
whatever
okay,
you-
so like, I mean, I do want to emphasize that postmodernism is not a stable movement, right? So most postmodern poets play with the modernist poem. So I mean, let's say The Wasteland is a high modernist poem by Eliot. Similarly, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. So what a postmodernist poem would do is it would pick up the form, the modernist forms, and then infuse it with something that you don't expect in a poem. Now, I can't recall an example off the cuff, but post-Cubist, like there are poems by like Hilda Doolittle and others, right? Where most of the times when you read it, there is no explanation. There are just sounds.
All right.
And then a lot of contemporary postmodernist poets also bring in forms from other cultures. So like ghazal, like after Agha Shahid Ali, has now become an accepted norm. And then Africa, the poems are about the African experience in juxtaposition with the colonial experience.
All right.
But all of them don't have an episteme of their own. They are still either expanding the modernist form, playfully sometimes, and sometimes seriously.
But how would you differentiate? How, when you read a poem, for example, if you're somebody who loves poetry and you're going through a poem, how would you realize that, in fact, this poetry is postmodernist in its approach?
Good question. I mean, in postmodernism, since the distance between high culture and popular culture is extremely condensed, so sometimes people would offer you jingles, like jingles that you hear on TV, and offer those to you as viable poems. That's one example. I can't really recall like a quintessentially postmodernist poem, but there is a poem called I Am Spider-Man.
All right.
So that poem plays with the mythos of Spider-Man, that there is a, and it's Spider-Man telling his own story. What do? I jump from one building to another whenever the mayor calls, but at the end of the day, all I'm doing is saving this TV or that building. And then towards the end, the poem becomes postmodern because the Spider-Man is now thinking of his own existence. And he says, well, maybe I could give it up, but I can't give it up because my suit is flame resistant. And maybe that's everyone's problem too. We can't burn our suits. And so that's where it becomes prophetic. It becomes about questions of existence. And that's another dominant of postmodernist fiction is that most of the times the question in postmodernist fiction and poetry is a question of existence.
All
Is
right.
this the only word? Is this the only way of living possible? In opposition to modernism, where the question is of knowledge. Do I trust this narrator, right? Did this really happen? So that's another distinction.
All right, Dr. Haj, while playing with syntax, while playing with words, not only does it affect literature, but it also affects poetry. Now, how can one apply the playfulness in words when it comes to postmodernistic poetry?
Well, unfortunately, my experience by and large with postmodernist poems has been that I don't understand them. I'm stuck in modernism myself because we have a lot of, we missed a number of decades where we could have been paying attention to literature and to beauty, the beauty of language, but were dissuaded from it because of part of the philosophy of science, namely positivism, which says the only thing that is science is stuff that you can measure. Pounds and grams are science. Meters and kilometers are science. Things, degrees of temperature is science. But it's not scientific to say, I love my daughter. They say, love is something which needs a scientific description, like maybe the number of heartbeats in a minute or something like that. But so for a long time in psychology and also in linguistics, until my great teacher Noam Chomsky came along and bombed one of the great positivist behaviorist psychologists, B.F. Skinner, who was one also would deny that meaning was forbidden territory until Chomsky's review of Skinner in 1958. And Chomsky actually saved linguistics from itself by showing that Skinner's idea of what language was in thinking was ridiculous. So
So does that apply to poetry as well, and how much do you feel it could apply to poetry?
Well, the idea that you can't talk about things like compassion or intuitions or suspicion or all of those things which there are no scientific, in quotes, definition of course, poets are the most subtle of writers, or maybe not the most subtle, but they would, of course, reject any statement like, we can't talk about emotion in poetry. No poem, I don't know any poems of any century where something like that you could get away with.
All right. You were talking about things being practical when you were saying, when you were talking earlier. Now, how practical do you feel is postmodernism as a concept, and also poetry in postmodernism? How practical do you feel it can be or it cannot be?
Well, I think life without play is not life. And so I think it's extremely practical to remember always to play. We were having a conversation which touched on precisely that. It's so it's vital. It's absolutely necessary that we don't get trapped into utilitarian language and we forget to say when we see a meteor crossing the evening sky. If we don't, Einstein says that. He says, if we cannot look at the star-filled skies and feel how wonderful life is and feel awe, anybody who cannot do that is as good as dead, he says. And I think that's right, too. I think people who think, I'm only interested in useful language, well, that's a horrible death, in my view.
What kind of inspiration can one draw from post-modernistic forms of literature or poetry, Dr. Masood?
Well, I mean, inspiration, I think mostly, as Haj pointed out, is that um, knowing that not everything in a work of art needs to be just about representing reality or needs to be earnest, that part of what we need in life is, laughter and the courage to laugh at ourselves and our history and the things that we consider part of our sacred history. I think postmodernism encourages us to approach these things with an open mind and maybe with a slightly facetious way of looking at very earnest historical facts.
All right.
And with that, I think we can live, in a way, a more meaningful life.
But Dr. Masood, are we ready as an audience for postmodernism?
Well, that's a very good question. I've written about it too, because when I read about postmodernism in America, in American Academy, what I'm being told is that it has arrived and it's universal. But when I look at my primary culture, I want to say that there are different kinds of postmodernisms. And certain acts of playfulness might be wonderfully acceptable in the West and in America, but we have to be cautious about how we use them over here.
All right, of course, being cautious is the key word. We'll, of course, move forward with our third and last segment, that is performing arts and theatre.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Kazo sent me. Bye.
Can you keep a secret? I'm trying to organize a prison break.
Amen.
Baby, when I saw you turning at the end of the street.
That for me?
Yeah, it can be for you.
Welcome back. You're watching the last segment of our show, The Classics, with an emphasis on performing arts and theatre. We'll start with Dr. Haj. Now, Dr. Haj, theatre is very important as a form of entertainment, as a form of education. So is performing arts, films or television. How does or how can one apply postmodernism to make people understand what it's all about through these forms of performing arts and theatre?
I think that in general, what I understand is poetry is pretty dead. Regular poetry, even just modernist poetry, even poetry, Victorian, sweet, nice poetry, is dead in America anyway. What exists is hip-hop and also cowboy poetry, and what's the other kind? Slam poetry, it's called. The kind of poetry which is studied in literature departments is, for the populace, it's dead. So it's very hard to find a publisher for a book of regular poetry. So I think that I don't think that's true for novels. I think well, I should defer to you. Novels sell if they're postmodern, right?
Yeah. But the performative aspect of art that as you were talking about is, like you mentioned, slams. So poetry slams are urban events, and in which local poets come and read their poems. But it's not just a mere reading of the poem, it's also a performance.
All right.
It's a competition,
And similarly,
too.
you were asking that how does, it's a competition too, how does postmodern performance differ from classical? So like, let's say Richard III is a classic Shakespeare play. There is a traditional rendition of it is by BBC, but about 10 years ago, Ian McKellen from BBC did a new rendition of it in which Richard III, is a Second World War Hitler-like figure. And so the props and everything are modernized. The story is the same. So that's a sort of a postmodern rendition of the same play, where you have changed the time period.
How does one be more impactful with postmodernism through films?
Well, I am fearlessly going to pass that one on to my friend.
Right. Now, like film, for example, there are quite a few examples. Playing with Time, Memento is a great movie. But right last month, new Mad Max movie came out. So we all who saw the old Mad Max movie, we knew that it was a male-dominant movie, right? In which our male protagonist finally finds the people who hurt his family and gets rid of them. But Mad Max now, of course,
Focuses on a woman.
is rendered visually through a technology not available to most of the modernists. But even in a movie called Mad Max himself is a marginal character because the hero, the heroine, is the woman whose narrative drives the story. That's a very postmodern redoing of a 70s, 80s movie, which was more in a traditional male-centric way.
Exactly.
So I think film has the most potential to change how we view reality.
Do you feel, Haj, that applying theories such as postmodernism now through different aspects, whether it be poetry or theater or film or literature, does it change human thinking? Does it have a kind of a positive attitude change, or is it more negative? I don't know, because I have not read much of postmodernistic literature as both of you might have, or watched. I mean, I did watch Mad Max, and I loved it for the way they twisted the original story, but still retained the essence.
Yeah.
What is your point of view?
Well, I think it's nice that we end our discussion on visual art, because the idea of one way to talk about the idea of postmodernism is looking at things through a different lens. And I think it's easier to do that maybe with vision, which is the primary, it's the modality, the sense modality, which is the closest to conceptual vision is. We say, I see what you mean, which is not visual, we're talking about understanding someone. So I think postmodernism, anyway, it's impossible to box art, to say art must be like this, and you can't make, for instance, Debussy, at the time he wrote his music, you were not allowed to have what were called parallel fifths. And he put parallel fifths in his music, and people said, you can't do that. And did you notice those are parallel fifths? And Debussy said, yes, and listen to how beautiful they sound. Art is always breaking down the barriers and going in new directions, and sometimes they're regrettable, and sometimes they're fabulous. I think it's great.
All right, Dr. Masood.
I agree with Haj, because I mean, it's very hard to pinpoint what postmodernism is and what's not, but I would rather have a movement called postmodernism, which at least gives us more ways of looking at art and reality, and always in comparison with other time periods. And I do think that nicely done postmodern art does have the ability to make us look at the world differently and maybe feel it differently and think about it differently.
All right. Dr. Haj, do you feel that people are changing with the times as far as linguistics, as far as syntax is concerned? I mean, we are in the postmodern time. I mean, I mean, we might not read a lot of it, but we are in these times. We cannot deny it. So how do you feel has the change been from the classic times to the modern times to the more postmodern times, as far as writing, whether a script for a film, whether a script for a theater play or a piece of literature or poetry is concerned? What changes do you feel have been brought in, and do you feel are they constructive enough?
I think that even if I should feel they were destructive, and if I was the czar of art and wanted to impose my will and stop something from being made, I would hope that the rest of the world would have the good sense to come and blow me away, because I don't think art can ever be put in a box. It's been tried again and again, and the kind of art, for me, it's quite amazing walking through a museum. It opens you. Your way of visual perception changes. Everything changes when you listen to a completely different kind of music, or you see a play and all of a sudden the person who is next to you gets up and with a gun and shoots the main character on the stage, and you realize, oh my God, the audience was part of the players, right? I think it's terrific not to let yourself get frozen and set in concrete.
All right, Dr.
Absolutely, I agree with Haj too that the changes can sometimes sound like destructive or disruptive, but I would rather have art change according to the world in which we live than have it ossified with an unchanging core. I think that would be the most destructive thing that can happen to us.
All right, well, the society needs to improve itself, and needs to understand what's right and what's wrong, and needs to evolve. Now, to evolve, of course, you need new forms, whether it be in literature, whether it be in poetry, in films, and in life as well. You need to think and you need to play with the words. That is what postmodernism is all about. Umar Khalid Butt bids you farewell from this episode of The Classics Show. We'll be back next week, same time, same channel. Till then, stay clean, stay cool, and do try to read some postmodernistic literature and come back to us through email or through fax of whatever you thought of it. Dr. Masood Raja, thank you so much.
Thank you so
Dr. Haj Ross, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure having both of you.
Same here.